Now for tonight, I am very pleased to introduce to you all Harold Knudsen. He's going to be talking about the Confederacy's most modern general, James Longstreet. Lieutenant Colonel Knudsen is an Illinois native. His career spans 25 years of active duty Army service and includes 7 resident career artillery command and Army staff schools and colleges. He has had many years of tactical experience in the integration of fire support into maneuver plans and fire control computation for cannon units. He spent 9 years in Germany training tactics, offensive armored warfare, as well as peacekeeping and counter-insurgency training. A combat veteran of Desert Storm, he performed extensive artillery fire planning and execution in support of the U.S. breakthrough of the Iraqi line and penetration into Iraq. He has also served in the Iraq campaign. His years of staff work at the Army Corps and Pentagon levels give him a strong understanding of Army operations from the lowest to the highest levels. So it is my pleasure to turn the screen over to our guest author.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let me hit share screen real quick and pull up my slides. Can you see my, whoops. Okay, can you see them? Can you see the slide? I'm going to go to the slideshow share version. I want to start just with a little, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. I want to just start with a little announcement just for people's information about the Longstreet Society, which is an organization I belong to. And they are there in Gainesville, Georgia. They own and run what is left of this hotel that General Longstreet bought in 1876, and he ran it until he couldn't any longer before he passed away. So it's now kind of a museum, and there are a number of things that we do every year. You can see them listed there. And this year we're going to have we are doing a seminar in Gettysburg, and we're going to have, I've gotten Corey Farr to be a tour guide on Saturday. He has a recent book about Longstreet as well. So here's our advertisement for it. So if anyone's interested, look at the Longstreet Society website and you'll learn a few things about him. So, okay, so I'm gonna start with another basic foundational bit of information before I get into the military things that I'm all about. And just to give people an understanding of where Longstreet fell out of favor, that's probably what most people know of him after the war during this period of time known as the Lost Cause. And, you know, a lot of things were said that were rather negative about him in this time period, like in this article here, appalling moral fall of him because of his political leanings after the war. And just to give you a quick timeline, you know, right after the war, he moved to New Orleans, and he started working at a cotton brokerage company and also an insurance company, lent his name there. He and Lee got a pardon from President Johnson in 1867. He also had helped Swinton write campaigns of the Potomac the year after the war, which set up the bit about he thought Lee had promised the defensive campaign. So that would come home to roost later as people like Jubal Early would come after him. But as the years went by, you know, he joined the Republican Party, and he became pro 13th Amendment and 14th Amendment when he was in charge of a militia in I think it was Alabama or Mississippi, I forget which state. You know, he put out guidance like this here, this General Orders 39. You know, so you can see what he says here. We all, you know, if you're going to be in it, you have to agree to the political equality of all men, not to deprive any person of color, race, or previous condition, or any political or civil rights. So these sorts of things didn't sit well with people like Jubal Early and William Pendleton and a few others. who were shaping the so-called lost cause propaganda, and he fell, and where he fell into it, they were going after him. So that's what a lot of people seem to know about General Longstreet from a lot of the popular works, the more well-known works by people like Douglas Southwell Freeman, excuse me. But for me, as a military person born in the 20th century, and here are some of my career in the schools that you already heard. But for me, once I became a professional soldier, and we would also have to go over military history as part of our training, and try and apply it and understand tactics and operations and the strategic things in the Army in our career, and practice with it and look at it in the maneuver training centers and the live fire ranges and other training environments in the military. Some of the things that I noticed about this General Longstreet, I got the impression that he was doing things right, that I started to think that he was a very modern thinking general for his time period, which is hence the title here that I used. And when you sand away all of that propaganda, I found him to be one of the better ones, the better thinking ones during the war. And that's why I came at him as my subject, and that's the angle and the lens that I look at him. So that's my introduction to where I'm coming from on him, which makes me a lot different than a lot of the different authors that have said anything about him in the past, going back to the late 19th century. So tonight I'm going to give you two primary examples, two in the tactical realm, which is the modern defense and the modern offense, and two of his largest pieces of work. Talk a little bit about his strategic estimate, also some fire support, and how he wanted to counter the Union Grand strategy. If I have a little time, I'll get into the level of operational art, which is above tactics. But it'll probably take me 45 minutes to go through these three primary bullets. So with that, again, another foundational slide here. This is, I want to just say the understanding that most military men had when they came out of, say, West Point in the antebellum decades, like most of these Civil War generals did. Most of them believed that and they were taught that combat was close quarters and that the tactical offense was generally dominant because it was close quarters. And this came out of the lessons of the Napoleonic warfare. And you can see that in this painting here from this battle in 1809. You can see that the formations, they actually had to get pretty close to each other to be able to unload on each other. And they were in these rigid formations. And that was because primarily of the firearms, the technology of the time, like this weapon here. This is the British Brown Bess, and other European nations had their own versions of this. And at the time of the American Revolution, at the time of the Napoleonic period, a musket like this could shoot roughly out to about 80 yards accurately. But like the quote here says, maybe even 100, but a soldier must be very unfortunate indeed who's going to be wounded at 150 yards. So that's why the units opposing each other had to get that close to each other to inflict casualties and kill one another because of this. This weapon can be loaded about 3 times a minute by a trained marksman, maybe 4. But that was the root cause of how the tactics worked at the time. These men would be put into these rigid line formations, and a whole unit, a regiment, would be like a giant shotgun. So in the British Army, for example, they might stand 80 yards out where they would initially take a volley and hopefully not take too many casualties, and then they would move forward while their opponent is reloading. Maybe they'd go 40 yards and then they'd stop and then they'd unload on them. And since they've cut the distance in half, they should be able to hit a lot more and inflict a lot more casualties than they received. And then maybe they would close quickly with the bayonet. So that's an example of why people believed at the time the tactical offense was dominant all things being equal. What I mean by all things being equal, both sides being on fairly open ground. Now, there were, of course, some examples of a growing obsolescence of direct approach, if you noticed it. And here are two major examples, one in the Revolutionary War and one in the War of 1812. And the difference here, where the tactical offense didn't work so well, is when the defenders had a couple of things going for them, a couple of advantages. One was they had prepared some kind of works, like you see in that picture there on the right. They had a resolute leader, an officer or officers who were confident and had everything prepared for them, and of course enough ammunition. Now, that Bunker Hill on the left there, the colonists inflicted quite a few casualties, 800 soldiers killed, British soldiers killed, but they had to cede the hill because they ran out of ammunition. But still, for those who noticed this was actually the reality and the truth when the defense was well planned and well thought out. So for General Longstreet, he graduated West Point in 1842 and came into the Army and went to Mexico with a lot of his compatriots. And I think he learned a stinging lesson there in one attack that his unit was part of, where they were repulsed. And the same thing happened with the Mexicans that they tried to attack. The Mexican units had prepared works, and they were using some walls. They had a good officer who instilled confidence in them, and they had plenty of ammunition, and so they repulsed the American unit, and James Longstreet was hit in the leg as well. So this was a stinging lesson for him that made him realize that the real truth is that the tactical offense is not always dominant. And because the weapons are getting better and better as the 1840s and 50s go by, it's not a truism at all that the tactical offense is dominant in war. And that's what he went into the Civil War understanding he had no break in service. But a lot of these guys who went into the war and got commissions, they did have a break in service, and they probably just didn't, consider this. I'll just say during the first year of the war in 1861, General Longstreet started out as a brigadier at Manassas, and then he went, he helped Joe Johnston, who was the Confederate Army commander in the Peninsula Campaign. And really his role was, he was a kind of a co-planner and a helper to Joe Johnston to start building the Army and getting, learning how to teach people to put the regiments together in the brigades, and then try to put the brigades together in divisions, and then maybe try and fight divisions cohesively in larger formations like wings and later corps. But everybody in that year was trying to figure out the jobs. There were a few people that had his level of understanding, and that's why I think he played a big role in helping Joe Johnston. When Joe Johnston was wounded and Lee took over for him, he did the exact same thing for Lee in finishing up the Peninsula Campaign for Lee. And then going forward to Second Manassas, where they finally put divisions together and created almost modern force structure as they went forward. And then after that, they moved right into Antietam, which is this battle here. And I think this is the one where General Longstreet gets the seed is planted in his head. He has the brainchild here for the tactical defense to do something with it on a grand scale. But what happens here is still pretty significant. The battle starts on the left there on Jackson's side in the cornfield, and that's a back and forth battle. But Jackson is able to maintain his side after an awful lot of pressure, after he's been reinforced by Hood and some help from General Longstreet. And then the Union starts in on Longstreet's side, which is known there as the Sunken Road. And you can see the units of Anderson and Rhodes on that kind of inverted V, gradual V. Those are in the sunken road, trying to hold off many times their number. Now, the soldiers that were in the sunken road, they were somewhat protected, and they were lower. They were only presenting their body from, say, the knees or the middle of the thigh up, and they were lower than the Union soldiers who were coming at them on that plain, perpendicularly off to the left from when you see the road and this fence there. And so they had that advantage of keeping their volleys lower, and they started inflicting tremendous casualties on these Union units that were coming at them like these perfect automatons. Later on, the Union was able to outflank, get to the right flank of the Confederate sunken road position and eventually unhinge it and push them back. And General Longstreet and his staff had to step in and even man cannon themselves because some cannon crewmen were wounded, and they were able to push them back some and stabilize their front. Now, the Union did take the sunken road. Longstreet didn't take it back, but the battle ended a couple hours after that, and then the Confederates did retain the field, and also they were not attacked the following day, but they had to leave Maryland shortly thereafter. They did lose their strategic initiative. That was stopped by the Union. So the Antietam was a Union strategic success, I would say, but a tactical success for the Confederate. But this was the lesson, I think, that General Longstreet brings forward going into December of 1862, where he builds what I consider a very modern textbook type of kill zone. Now, President Lincoln decides to put General Burnside in charge of the Union Army, and Lee and Longstreet are out at Culpeper Courthouse when they get the news about this, and they're kind of upbeat because they know that General Burnside is a major general and he's a division commander, and so now he's going to be skipped over the corps level experience, and he's going to be thrust into the Army level command, and so he's not. He doesn't have the foundation for it, and Burnside himself is quite intimidated by the job. So Lee tells Longstreet to get out to Fredericksburg and look at where to set up a blocking position. He would go get Stonewall Jackson and further out west and bring him in as soon as he could. So Longstreet gets out here, and the first thing he notices is this Marie's Heights there. On the top picture, you see the high ground there, on the bottom and to the left. And then this open plain between Marie's Heights and the town back in the distance. And that's where that's what he sees and envisions of where he wants to fight this battle. He wants to channel the Union Army into this. Now he finds another sunken road, which is the bottom left picture there. And this one is even better than the one at Antietam, because this one has a stone wall that abuts right up to that plain where the Union soldiers are going to come across. And it's tall. It's tall enough up to the shoulders of a man. And so the Confederate riflemen can stand right up to it and lean against it. On this is the best spot along the stone wall. They can rest their elbows there on the stones and take well-aimed shots. And so he envisions that they're going to do much better here even than they did in Antietam if they can get the Union to come into this kill zone. And then he'll also sight in all of the artillery into the same spot. And I'll talk about artillery here after the infantry piece. So the plan is, now this is from the other side. This is the Union side. This is a picture from one of those plaques there at Fredericksburg. Longstreet's idea was he was not going to oppose the Union Army right from the bank of the river on the other side of town. That's Fredericksburg there in the back, and across the river from the Union's vantage point. He's going to put a few people in there to take some shots at them, but he wants them to be able to finish their bridge and bring their army across, take the town, go through the town, get their army assembled again, and then come into that kill zone and attack him. That's what he wants to do. So this is a bit of a trick, a ruse to get them to come across, and it works. They do. They come across and chase off the Confederate soldiers that are hiding in between the houses and luring them in, so to speak. And then they start off on the actually on their left, which is off of this slide. Again in the morning, they go after Stonewall Jackson. Now, Jackson had just arrived the day before. Lee had just arrived with him, and Jackson's men only had about a day to do any kind of digging, position improvement. So they dug a ditch or trench line, and what they were able to do was sort of like what resulted in sort of like what Longstreet had at Antietam. So Jackson's men were protected again from, say, the knee up, and that was about it, which is still better than just standing out in the open. And the Union attacked his side, and they did manage to penetrate him at one spot. In fact, it was Major General Meade who made a hole and pushed through, and then Jackson reacted and marshaled troops, reserves, and then pushed him back out and stabilized his side. And that ended the morning phase of Fredericksburg. And then about 1 o'clock, Burnside starts in on General Longstreet's position at Marye's Heights, which is the strongest Confederate position in all of their deployments. And they come through the town just like he had envisioned. There's no real room to maneuver because you've got the canal there off to the Union right and no room to maneuver to the left to try and get around anything. And you got a drainage ditch to the left. So you got to come through this kill zone and then and right into the base of Marye's Heights. And Longstreet's got everything waiting for him. So they go in there and they try 13 times, 13 major assaults. This goes on from 1 o'clock to 3:30, maybe a quarter to 4. And every single one of them is broken up as they meet this hailstorm of lead that he throws out there. And that dotted line, that dotted irregular shape, is supposed to be where where most of the Union soldiers fell as they took fire from the Confederates, and none of them got within 100 feet of the wall. So then Burnside calls it off at about a quarter to 4, and it's, of course, a horrible event then for the Union and for the Lincoln administration. So what I see here on this scale, and this is that, this is where Lee is up there with him watching, and he has this reaction, makes that famous statement about how horrible he even thought it was to see this happen to his opponents. But what General Longstreet does here that to me seems like a radical lethality in the Civil War is he really does apply the principles of what we call a kill zone, 20th century kill zone. Now in the Army, what I learned even my first year in 1983 in basic training was a kill zone is ideally something you build on kind of a concave shape on slightly higher ground if you can, so that all of your firers can achieve an interlocking field of fire, kind of a crisscross. And by doing that, nothing in the kill zone, there's no safe space to hide and duck for the enemy. Everything is covered by somebody somewhere. And that's just the infantry. So that's one of the things he does here. Now, this one here at Fredericksburg is not exactly concave. It's more linear, but there's not a lot of space. There's nothing out there for the Union to really hide behind. And so they do, get the full brunt of Longstreet's infantry when they're within rifle range. Another thing you do when you're building a kill zone is you're assigning clear lanes of fire for your firers up there on the wall in this case. That means each soldier is only supposed to shoot straight ahead of them, and they're not allowed, they have to be disciplined. If they see a target off to the right or off to the left, that's not their target. They're not supposed to touch that. That's somebody else's responsibility to the left or to the right down the line. You just pick a target in your lane and shoot as many as you can in your lane and maintain that discipline throughout the engagement. And what they do, and since they didn't have modern repeating rifles and machine guns like we have, what he does here that is also pretty interesting is that he has a line of firers, but as you can see in this drawing here, this was done about 20 years after the war for a magazine. He has also men, 1 to 2 men behind each firer, that all they do is load rifles, load the empty rifle. They don't participate in shooting. They just, the firer picks a target, he fires, hands back the empty. One of those loaders hands him a loaded rifle, and he's ready to go. So when I told you that the musket, a trained marksman could only load it and shoot it about 3 times a minute, maybe 4. In this case, now the firers were shooting being handed a loaded rifle and shooting 8, 9, 10, 11 times a minute, tripling, quadrupling their rate of fire. And that's how they achieved like this effect of almost a machine gun at this location on a large scale here in 1862. And that's the infantry. Then we have what he does with the artillery. Now here's a typical battery. There's 6 guns. I know the picture shows 3, so off to the right or left you'd have 3 more guns. But this is a typical field artillery piece, could shoot about a mile, maybe a little bit further. And it was essentially a direct fire weapon. It would have a little bit of an arc to it. Maybe the shell would be about 6 feet off the ground at the middle of its arc before it came down a little bit if you're shooting at a mile. Its target's about a mile away. So they could see, at least initially, what they were shooting at until the smoke accumulated and made it difficult. But to compare, in the future to what happens in the future, I'll give you some idea of how this plays into the tactics that are used here. Now, the gray arrow to the left, the most left gray arrow there near the red target symbol, that's your field artillery piece from the Civil War that moved out with the armies. And then that other cannon there, the rifled cannon, 1863, that could shoot a little bit over 2 miles, but it generally was in a carriage. It was too heavy to move out with the maneuver army. So that's the scale that you can see compared to the modern weapons. But later on, when the breech was perfected, that you loaded the cannon from the back of the gun, the breech, instead of the front of the gun, the muzzle, and they figured out how they could close the breech with the spring system so that it could withstand the expanding gases and throw these shells an amazing distance to distances out beyond the horizon. Then came in the need for precise mathematical and geometrical calculations of fire support. And then you have a grid system and range deflection protractors and all of that, so you can do precise calculations. And that's what we have with modern artillery, like that 155 millimeter gun there, the one that looks kind of like a tank. That was my weapon in Desert Storm. It can shoot 15 miles, indirect fire. The one to the far right, the 200 millimeter, 203 millimeter self-propelled howitzer, could shoot over 20 miles. And you can see on the graph, at that range, the round goes 7 miles in the air before it starts to come down. But all of this is still very accurate and precise. And it's all tied together with radio communication, digital communications with computers. So it allows you to spread out your cannon units and then converge all of these fires. And that's what modern artillery does. It starts in World War II, the use of computers. All of these banks fill up a whole room. Now, this was intended, I think, for naval gunfire initially, but it improved and improved over the decades. And all of that now fits into like this laptop here you see on the left. It goes in a track, and the soldiers do all of the calculation from the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, to send gun commands, fire commands down to the guns and mass artillery. So that's modern artillery. But Longstreet, he doesn't have any of this in 1862. And in the 18th and 19th century, that meant that most artillery is decentralized. It's direct support to the maneuver units. So for example, if this terrain on the bottom is Mary's Heights, and say that a battery of 4 guns there on the left is firing straight ahead, they're supporting a maneuver infantry unit that's right in front of them to help them break up this attack that's coming at them. But they don't shoot over to the right to support somebody else, because they're just the habitual association and the doctrine was that they just support the unit in front of them. But in our day, because of what I showed you with the ranges, the long ranges now of the modern artillery, we can do this, we can do direct support, and we can also do centralized reinforcing fires of artillery by tying everything in with, say, radio and computer digital communications to pass gun commands to all the artillery batteries so that they can pile in on a single target if we want to. And in a situation like this is what Longstreet does at Fredericksburg. He takes away the artillery from the maneuver units and he puts it all under the control of his artillery coordinator, Porter Alexander, who works directly for him. And everything then piles in, fires into the kill zone, piles in on the same targets to break them up, in this centralized role. You can see there the first 3 Union assaults were broken up exclusively by the artillery. They didn't even get close enough yet for the infantry to open up on it. And one last thing here, those dotted lines on the right, on the bottom right, when you go to Fredericksburg and you go to that hill called Lee's Hill, where Lee set up his headquarters when he got there, there are a couple of these heavier ordnance pieces. They don't have wheels, but Longstreet had called down to Tredegar Iron Works when he was setting up, the defense here, and asked if they could send down some of those heavier coastal guns, and they got a few of them down there. And from gun to target, from Lee's Hill to the kill zone in front of Marie's Heights, they were shooting about 2 miles, maybe a little more than 2 miles, shooting over the Confederate field artillery, shooting over the Confederate infantry to hit targets in the kill zone and pile in along with the field artillery and the infantry. And I thought that was pretty amazing, a very modern approach that he does here in December of 1862. So all of these things that he's doing here is a textbook modern 20th century United States Army kill zone that he does at Fredericksburg. And here's a nice quote that he says in his article in Battles and Leaders in 1884. This is the situation. 65,000 Confederates massed around Fredericksburg, and they had 20 odd days in which to prepare for the approaching battle. So, now he's developed this one play, if you want to use a sports term, for what he thinks is one way they should conduct a war. This kind of preparation on a large scale to inflict these mass casualty exercises on the Union Army and try and wear them down over time. And so after December, as they're going into early 1863, he's thinking about this. What do we do? The Confederacy does not have anything that you can really call as a grand strategy, but the Union does. Even from the beginning, General Winfield Scott, who was aging but still on active duty when the war began, had advised Lincoln that they should do a couple of things that constitutes a grand strategy. First of all, we're going to have a naval blockade along the eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico to prevent the Confederates, or at least make it difficult, if not quite prohibitive, for them to get things from Europe, war materials and weapons and so on, from Europe and maybe other nations. Then we're going to, second part is divide the Confederacy along the Mississippi River, which they were also doing right from the beginning, as Grant was working on that, starting with Donelson and the forts up there in Kentucky, Tennessee, and he was now working on Vicksburg, Mississippi by early 1863. And the last part 3, was supposed to be these coordinated offensives by the major Union armies simultaneously to weigh on the Confederacy and make it difficult for them to resist them, but use their number advantages and attrition. So the Union was doing numbers 1 and 2 pretty well, but they weren't doing 3 very well yet in 1862 and 3. They were not coordinating the major offensives, and that gave the Confederacy an opportunity to deal with one at a time and recover to some extent. And so that's what Longstreet sees Fredericksburg to work on three even more and try and come up with a counter strategy where you are going to build these windows of numerical superiority, supremacy over a targeted Union army and go after it, attack it, hopefully defeat it, and then realign again. And another thing he thinks about is what is the defensible then perimeter of the Confederacy. He felt that we have to, this strategy, this strategic defense, this defensive offense, defensive being strategic, offensive being operational, would be confined to the major Confederate armies, everything east of the Mississippi River, because you have your primary armies are Lee in Virginia, Bragg in Kentucky, Tennessee, and would be in Georgia, and then the next lower level down in Mississippi, Alabama. Those were under Johnston primarily, and try and use those in the interior lines of the nation with the rail line to try and build these windows of numerical superiority. The rail line on this picture is depicted in green and red, which shows two different gauges. So it's not great, it's not ideal, it's not optimal, but they could still make it work. And that's what he wanted to do. Now, everything to the west of the Mississippi, they were just out there, they were just going to have to do the best they could because they just didn't have the numbers of people and the force structure to put together a major army. So that would be mostly cavalry and smaller irregular forces. But this is what he wanted to do going into 1863. And he felt that they were doing well enough in the east that they should go and reinforce the situation in the west. Prevent what Grant says here. This would be the following year when Grant takes over. Grant starts to make Part 3 work for the Union. So far as practical, all armies are to move together toward one common center. He's just following up on what General Scott had said earlier. So before this happens, Longstreet wants to do a Western concentration now after Fredericksburg. There were two choices at the time. There was Tennessee and reinforced Bragg, or Mississippi under Johnston. Lee, though, he doesn't want to go. He doesn't go for this at the time, and he doesn't want to give up the assets to do this. And he works on some of the politicians and convinces them that the option then should be an invasion of Pennsylvania. By doing that, then maybe the Lincoln administration would be forced to tell Grant to suspend his activities in Mississippi, stop going after Vicksburg and send troops east to deal with Lee in Pennsylvania. When it comes to the point where that's what they're going to do, although General Longstreet does not think this is a good idea, then he counters Lee and says, well, if that's what we're going to do, then let's do a defensive campaign where, even though it's an offensive strategy, we're going into Pennsylvania. When we're up there, why don't we set up another defensive battle? My corps will receive the assault, and then the other two will protect me on the flanks. Now, after Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson dies of pneumonia, so Lee has to promote someone else, and he's going to reorganize the army, and he's going to go from 2 wings to 3 corps. So he's going to promote 2 major generals to lieutenant general, and that's Dick Ewell and A.P. Hill, to be the 2nd and 3rd Corps. And so that's, Longstreet takes those 2 into account, and that's where he comes up with this idea of what they should do in Pennsylvania. So, but let me just give you an idea real quick of this thought that he has here of Western concentration, of what he had probably envisioned to how to stop Vicksburg from falling. And here's the situation in Vicksburg here in April and May of 1863. Grant had already tried to take Vicksburg two times and he was repulsed. Nathan Bedford Forrest had ripped up his supply lines on the second try, and that caused a long waste of time. But he maneuvered south, Grant did, and then he lands at Bruinsburg. He gets 20,000 across initially, and he chases off a Confederate unit there near Port Gibson. There's a short battle there. Now, at this point, Pemberton is in charge of the Confederate fortress at Vicksburg, and he looks at this situation and he's not too worried initially. He thinks Grant's just going to go straight north after him, and that he thinks, well, I'm ready for him. I've got my defenses all the way around, so I'll just repulse him again. But that's not what Grant does. This time, Grant confuses the Confederate leadership, and he starts moving northeast across the state, heading toward Jackson. And the Confederates don't mass and go after him. They're spread out in 3 different places. You got Pemberton with the most troops in Vicksburg. You got 5,000 more in the north of the state, and another 8,000 under Johnston at Jackson. And they got that excellent rail line that goes east and west between Jackson and Vicksburg. They could have used to move faster than Grant, but they don't really take advantage of that and come after him. Now, if they'd done so, when Grant was about halfway to Jackson, there you see that number there, Grant 35,000. He had to stop there and take a pause. He had to wait for supplies, and he was waiting for Sherman to get across. At that point in time, he was vulnerable. And if they had massed against him, it would have been about 1-to-1 odds, 36,000 to 35,000. But it doesn't happen. Excuse me. Grant, now at this point in time, though, if troops had come in from Virginia, say it was Longstreet, 20,000 more, Corps plus, that's going to bring their numbers up to 56,000 if they hit them at this point in time. And now you got 2-to-1 attacker defender ratio. Now you got a better chance of having a good result. And if they had done this, who knows? And if Grant had lost the battle here, he might have lost his job. And then if he's out of the picture, a lot of things are going to be different. But this doesn't happen, and Grant moves across, continues on, and he takes Jackson, and then he turns west and heads toward Vicksburg. And Pemberton finally comes out to try and challenge him, but he's outnumbered 2-to-1. He gets beat at Champion Hill, and then also at Big Black River Bridge, and he has to fall in behind the fences at Vicksburg to endure a miserable siege, and then he surrenders on the 4th of July. The day before, Lee is repulsed in Pennsylvania at Gettysburg at Pickett's charge. So now they've gotten 2 major defeats in the same couple of days. And the Confederacy is not, the fortunes are not looking good for the Confederacy at this point in time. But this gives you an idea of what General Longstreet was advocating to try and counter what the Union was doing. So after the results at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Lee comes around to Longstreet's idea of Western concentration and realizes, well, this is our only chance then. We have to do this. I guess we should have done it earlier. Now, it might be too late, but we have one more chance. And this is with reinforcing Bragg. Now, Bragg had been shoved down from Tennessee into northern Georgia as well by General Rosecrans, who had just completed his excellent Tullahoma campaign, which doesn't, most people don't know very much about because it wasn't a bloody campaign. I think the whole thing, only some 500 or 600 Union soldiers were killed in all of the minor skirmishes. Most of it was maneuver. He kept outmaneuvering Bragg, and Bragg had to cut and head south, further south, until he is down here in northern Georgia below Missionary Ridge. He even had to give up Chattanooga. But Rosecrans, at the end of the campaign, he's made a mistake. And here it is. You can see it in this picture, in this map. His 3 corps are way too spread out at the end result. And Bragg recognizes this. They're so spread out they can't support each other if one is attacked suddenly. And Bragg starts moving toward the middle one. He decides, I'm going to go after Thomas. And Thomas himself has made a mistake. He's moved the division of Negley too far forward, away from the rest of the corps. So another carrot that Bragg is going to go after. So Bragg starts moving there on the 18th of September. By the 18th of September, I meant to say they have the first contact at a bridge, and then the main battle starts on the 19th. Now here's this older map. I'll orient you to it. You can see the city of Chattanooga there by the river, and then Missionary Ridge, and all of the units below it, the Union in the dark and the Confederates in the red. Now Bragg it wants to, it's going to try to attack the Union left and fold the Union left and push and shove all those units down into this area in the bottom left that I have this gray oval there it's called Lemoore's Cove. And we call this in the military non-permissive terrain, means command and control becomes very difficult because of the hills, all of the tight hills and the thick woods and everything. So he wants to push them down into that area on the south side of Missionary Ridge and keep them away and cut them off from their new base at Chattanooga. And if he does this, the Union Army there is in a lot of trouble because there's nowhere to get supplies from. They would have to probably infiltrate across the state line into Alabama and then make their way north to Bridgeport and the Stevenson area, which is off this map, but that's their only railhead where they could get supplies from. So it's not a bad battle plan that Bragg has here. But what happens on the 19th is he does have problems, internal problems in the Army with dissemination of and communication of orders and execution. He's always been plagued with this, and he's never seemed to get this straightened out. And so, you know, the attacks don't come off very well. He doesn't have good cavalry eyes out either. He's never developed that either. So, you know, some units go down the wrong routes and get fouled up, and they just don't get the jump on the Union that they could have, that Lee's army probably would have. They do these things. Lee's army did these things generally a little bit better than Bragg's army. But anyway, Bragg's army still pushes, and they shove the Union army. It's just that they never now got a chance to take advantage of that one corps all by itself, because by the end of the day, on the 19th, the rest of the corps, Union Corps, come together, and Rosecrans has got his army put back together, although they're on the defense and being shoved back. The left wing of the Confederate Army has no lieutenant general, just the right wing does, which is Polk. You've just got these different units who've never worked together before, trying to make things happen. You've got Hood from Virginia with 3 brigades from Virginia trying to push. And they all manage to push, but they're fighting these piecemeal battles, and that's the best that they can do as far as coordinating on that day. So the day ends with the Confederates still in control of the initiative. They just never folded the Union Army and shoved them where they wanted to go, or ruptured their line. Now, General Longstreet gets there about 11 o'clock on the evening of the 19th at Ringgold Station, which is just off the map to the left. And Bragg has sent no one there to greet him. And they only have a few horses on the train. And he brings in a couple of 2 more brigades from Virginia come with him on that train. So Longstreet and some of his staff try and find their way in the dark to find General Bragg, and they run into a Union picket line. I guess they got too far forward. They run into Union pickets, and the Union pickets don't know who he is. They can't tell the color of the uniform in the dark. And Longstreet just pretends that, oh, well, we're just a little bit lost. Can you tell us where a good spot to ford is? And the Union soldiers tell him, oh, just go a little further down. And they kind of back out of that situation and get away. So they could have lost General Longstreet to capture that within an hour of him arriving, but he slipped out of that situation quickly. And then he found Bragg's headquarters. He found the Confederate Army and found Bragg's headquarters, and they had a meeting from 11 to midnight or so. Bragg gave him a map of the area and told him to take charge of the left wing, and then he was going to resume to try and redo the battle plan the next day, starting on the right, the Confederate right, and do an en echelon attack. En echelon means the most right unit is going to start the ball, and then when they go, then the unit to their left goes, and then the next, and the next, and the next, all the way down until the last, the last unit on the Confederate left is like the hinge point. So the whole thing is supposed to sweep to the right, and they're going to try and shove the Union again back to the southwest if they could. So that's the plan, and it's supposed to kick off around 7 a.m. when the sun is coming up. And then, Longstreet goes over to his wing early in the morning, and they get a few hours of sleep, and then he's up in the morning, but nothing's going on, and he hears nothing at 7 a.m. and the Confederates don't get going on the right until like 10 o'clock. Because the orders didn't get all the way down to the most right Confederate unit, so it never started when it was supposed to start. So General Longstreet, on the morning of the 20th, realizes that this whole plan has miscarried even before it even started. So he's got to come up with something else. And the right finally starts at about 10, but Longstreet in this time, before, or just after 7, he starts forming something else and coming up with a different plan. But what happens here is that I'll just go through the plan real quick, is Longstreet gets the word to attack at 11, and he pushes through and he collapses the entire Confederate and the entire Union right. Rosecrans panics and retreats, and then they shove the Union, the panicking side, up onto Snodgrass Hill, where they fight them until the end of the day. So it's a resounding victory. But the difference is what makes this a modern attack, World War II style attack, is what I want to explain here in this theme, in this thesis of why he's a modern general. Here's the Brotherton cabin. Now it just happens to be that there's a private, Tom Brotherton, in one of the Georgia regiments in the Army of Northern Virginia, and this word gets to General Longstreet that this guy Tom Brotherton grew up and born in this cabin on this property right there where he wants to attack through. So he gets the private to report to him, and he asks him, "Is there a trail or something that I can use as a guide? I have an idea of a formation that'll take me through those woods there in the back. That's where the Union Army is, and get me through the woods as a guide to line up on, to get me into the open terrain on the other side so I can use that fast go terrain to maneuver." And Brotherton tells him, yes, there's a trail right off to the right, and it goes right through the woods. And today it looks like this. It's paved, but this was a cow trail then. And you can see through the trees, it's open back there. So that's what he's going to use. Now, where I'm going with this is not unlike the way the tactics were in the Second World War, in that doctrine, if you want to call it doctrine, called Blitzkrieg. Now, the man there on the bottom right, that's General Heinz Guderian. He was really what we call him today, the grandfather of offensive armored warfare. He's the man who started writing about putting the tank together in large formations at the division level. He said that the engine of a tank is no less a weapon than the main gun of the tank. And if we put these together in large formations, and we don't use them to just fight and slug out battles like the infantry do, but we use them in neat, compact, narrow attack formations, what he called the Schwerpunkt, the point of the main attack, and rupture a narrow point of an enemy line, and then drive into the rear areas and go deep into the rear areas and take enemy headquarters, rip down their communications, attack their logistics, cut their rail lines, and all these kinds of things. Then that whole army that you see there, the Russian ones that are in the tan color, opposite the Germans in the blue, and the Italians, I think they're in the green, the whole thing starts to collapse. And this was what they did in what became known as the Lightning War, the slang term, the Blitzkrieg. They did this, the Poland in 1939, France 1940, Russia in 1941, like in this map here, and it worked. And that was because of the doctrine of the mass at the operational level. But at the tactical level, this is the German word that became famous in World War II, the Schwerpunkt, the point of the main attack, where you're going to weight your attack with a lot of power. And here he does something like this at Chickamauga. When he gets over to the left wing after he'd been to Bragg's camp at night, he finds these 4 divisions, Western divisions, Preston, Hindman, Johnson, Stewart. He goes to see Stewart first, and Stewart says, we got this vacant space that we probably ought to close up. So Longstreet orders everyone to shift to the right and close up on Polk. Then he's got the 5 brigades from Virginia under Hood, and those line up just behind Major General Bushrod Johnson, his 3 brigades in front. He says, I'm going to use all of these. All these are going to be now in one formation. All these 8 brigades of 2 divisions, they're going to be they line up in 5 echelons, the way he describes it. You can see them here also in 5 echelons. And this is what's going to go forward. I'm going to throw this right through the enemy line because I know on the other side, there's probably 1 division in front of me. He figures that there should just be 1 division, and a typical division in the Civil War had 3 brigades on both sides. If it's 1 division, that means the Union might have a depth of 2 brigades. So if I have 8 brigades, that's 8 to 2 in depth. That's a 4 to 1 attacker to defender ratio. And he figures I have plenty of strength to smash right through there. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it on a narrow front. Now, there's something that he doesn't even know about that happens. General Rosecrans on the other side thinks there's some gap in the Union left wing, and he sends the division of Major General Wood that happens to be right in front of this column. He moves it over to the right, and that's what those dotted arrows are. And there's no gap, but now he creates a gap right in front of this attack column. And when Longstreet finally gives the word to attack, 1 of the brigades is in the way, so that's why I have there 8 to 1 odds as this Schwerpunkt attack column steamrolls that 1 Union brigade right out of the way. So, you know, this sort of thing became really the method of war in World War II to have success. Here's an example of what Rommel uses it for to get that, to take that town. Here he says, concentrating strength at 1 point, forcing a breakthrough. That's the key to the whole thing, you know, not wasting it on rolling up a front line, but getting into the rear areas and forcing something. And then the Americans and the British finally learned this too later in the war. But, you know, General Patton, before he takes over the Third Army, he's very, disappointed in the way Eisenhower was running the landing Normandy in July of 1944. He's left a couple of writings that are very critical about it. He said, look at this comment he has here on the that I have underlined here. He's trying to push all along the front, but he has no power anywhere. And by the end of June 1944, you know, the Germans had started bringing in a lot of reinforcements into the area, and they had this thing almost completely arrested. In fact, this is something you don't hear about much in the history of World War II. Where the movies and the TV documentaries and everything make it sound like they landed and just swept across France, but it wasn't that way in the first month. You know, by the end of June, the Germans had them pretty well stopped. And Eisenhower even wrote a draft letter saying that he felt by the end of June, early July, that the landings had failed and he was going to have to withdraw. And this was never sent anywhere, but I guess it's the draft letter is still in existence. And so when Patton takes over, he turns this on its head and does exactly like the Germans have done earlier in the war. Narrow penetration, breakthrough, and then start just going gangbusters into the rear areas like you see here. You know, getting it right when the moment arrives, as he said. So that's what you have. That's what you have here in 1863. You see the Brotherton cabin off to the right. and then the wood line with the Union Army to the left, and it's only 175 paces. Those are my paces. I paced that out. I took this picture at Chickamauga one September, and he was just going to quickly leap forward and be right on him, like a German tank division in France in World War II. Much better than the situation at, say, Gettysburg. Now look at the plain that they had to go across at Gettysburg. And look at how the Confederates look at how their order of battle was at Gettysburg. All these brigades, shoulder to shoulder, no strength anywhere, 1 mile wide. They had to go 1.5 miles in that open area to get hit by artillery and then musket fire, and then supposedly converge at the clump of trees. Just not a good plan when you're so exposed like this. And then they had to climb over these fences. In the Battle of Germantown, 1777, Timothy Pickering, who was a Federalist, later a Federalist, he said these fences were so troublesome in their day. So I can just, you can just imagine what this did to the Confederates as well. So, here at Chickamauga, completely much better. He's got the 2 lead brigades of Bushrod Johnson's division, Fulton and McNair, and they're only 450 yards wide at the most, not a mile wide, just 450 miles wide. And the whole Schwerpunkt, the whole column is right behind them. Now here's this plaque that's at the Brotherton cabin there at the battlefield. It's a little washed out from the sun, so I'm sorry for the quality, but you can see the first echelon coming at them, the second echelon, and the third one's coming out of the woods. And there are 2 more behind that the Union don't even see. And as this thing's uncoiling, just like they did in the Second World War. And so here's the big picture. The Schwerpunkt is the dotted rectangle. It breaks through, and then it turns right and uses the fast-go terrain to try and get in behind the Union left wing. And so Longstreet's plan now was to try and bag this whole army if he could, as fast as he could. It's just that the guy who was thinking on his feet on the Union side was Major General Thomas, and he was able to hold them at Snodgrass Hill until dark, and then he extricated the army, and that resulted in the campaign in Chickamauga. So I think I've gone a little more than I should. So I think I'll stop here and take a few questions. But anyway, those are the 2 main pillars, I think, in the tactical level that I think show in his body of work a very modern thinking man for the Civil War period. And I talked about a little bit about strategy and a little bit about fire support as well.
Well, thank you for that. And if you want to, let's see, let me go to some questions here. Whoop. My cat just knocked something off the desk. But that was fascinating. I really appreciated the comparison of
Thank you.
Longstreet's tactics with kind of a more modern perspective, and then also the comparison between Chickamauga and Gettysburg. So it's great to have a military man explaining these things.
Yeah, I think that's kind of illuminating to look at the 2 different ways of attacking, one much better than the other. I don't know that attack formation would work as well, being pounded by artillery either at Gettysburg, but it would be much better than what they did,
Yeah, very interesting. Well, getting to the questions, Niels asked, and I think this was prompted by kind of the earliest portion of your talk, but how would you describe Longstreet's views on race and civil rights? Because he notes that during the war, Longstreet at one point issued a racially charged proclamation to his troops declaring the North had inaugurated a policy of trying to impose racial equity. So that seems definitely to have changed by the time of Reconstruction and Longstreet's stance as a Republican. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, in his memoir, his memoir that he wrote in 1896, the word slavery only appears one time in that nearly 800 pages, and it's just in the context of the Lincoln at the end of the war was then going to try and go for abolition, with try and get a 13th Amendment passed in the Congress there, after it's clear that he's won the re-election in November of 1864, and I think he then tries to do that in the January, February of 1865. But I think Longstreet is just saying during the war that Lincoln had now tried to bring slavery. What does he say in his memoir? Something that had been only tacitly and covertly understood, and bringing it making it a part of the way to prosecute the war. And that's what he says that in context of the Emancipation Proclamation there after Antietam. So I don't know that Longstreet said anything that we can consider racially charged. They didn't think in those terms the way we do today. I think most people believe that at the time, even in 1862, 1863, and Lincoln as well, did not think that, even if people were against slavery, I don't think very many people thought that they may think slavery was immoral, but they didn't think that ending slavery or abolition was a possibility, because they weren't sure what would black people do. That was really, I think, what most people thought. And probably Longstreet was the same. Now, I don't know if General Longstreet ever owned a slave or bought a slave. I have no idea. He probably never bought one. He was a professional Army officer. He probably never needed one. Although I know that he had a cook in the Confederate Army who was a black man. But I think he was, I think he was paid like other soldiers were as well. So I don't know if he was a slave. I have no idea. I just don't know enough about it. At the end of the war, after the war, not just the end of the war, but after the war, General Longstreet took the position that our side lost the war, and the winning side decided that they were going to abolish slavery. And so, we have been asked magnanimously to come back into the Union, and General Grant says we are brothers again. And President Lincoln said his wish was that they could bring the nation back together with malice toward none. So that means they're going to treat us, as Americans again. And if we're going to be Americans again, then we should support what the result is of the war. We have to accept the result of the war and the political results of the war. That's the position that General Longstreet took after the war. And that's the position, that's why he then supported equality for the Negro after the war, to include the 14th Amendment. Now, I don't even know if Abraham Lincoln would have supported the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment came after his life, because Lincoln's writings say before, I have no intention of putting the Negro on par with the white man, even though he didn't like slavery. So he may have been only for the abolition of slavery, but we don't know if he was for these concepts of equality that, General Longstreet was later seemed to be for. Especially, you could see it 1868, 1869, 1870 in some of his writings. He seemed to support equality for the Negro, which was, not heard of almost on either side, really. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, I think it does. And another one from Larry, he says, how does Porter Alexander compare to Henry Hunt at Pickett's charge?
Oh, good question. Well, and the other question was good too. Well, Henry Hunt did an excellent job. Henry Hunt was, in my view, maybe the finest artillery coordinator on the Union side, well, maybe in the whole war. Porter Alexander was pretty good, but Porter Alexander, there's something that he didn't do that he should have done as an artillery coordinator on the third day, and he should have said to General Longstreet, he should have been straightforward and said the artillery effects, I can't tell what our effects are, and we haven't accomplished the fire support mission. I mean, we did not reduce the Union artillery, and although they couldn't really tell, and they didn't put a dent, they didn't do anything to neutralize, suppress, or destroy the Union infantry in front of where the attack was supposed to go in. And doctrinally in my army, if there's no effects on target, you need to tell the maneuver commander there's no effects on target and you're going to be facing an enemy that's full strength. We didn't do anything about it. And then at that point, General Longstreet would have a tough decision. Would he have to call off the attack? And he'd have to take that to General Lee. And we can only guess what General Lee would have said. Nobody knows. It's not knowable, but they would have been in a tough spot. Now, Henry Hunt on the other side, Henry Hunt did a magnificent job of, and he controlled the artillery, just like Longstreet took away all the artillery from the maneuver units at the Battle of Fredericksburg and put it under the Porter Alexander, the artillery coordinator. Henry Hunt did this role exactly right at Gettysburg. Meade took away all the artillery from the maneuver units, from the infantry units, and put it all under Hunt on the morning of July the 3rd. And Hunt controlled it all. And there were some, Union generals who were complaining about this. And Hunt, as a brigadier general, told these major generals, hey, stay out of my business. The artillery does not belong to you right now. The commanding general has put it under me, the artillery coordinator. And Hunt, did a great job. He kept some of it in the reserve, and he didn't move too much of it forward when the Confederates were trying to hit them. Now the Confederates were kind of shooting blind at the Union artillery, and they managed to take out about 34 cannon. But when Hunt started opening up on the Confederate infantry as Pickett's men and the other brigades came across, he had, I think, still some 75 guns firing when they started to come, and then he moved up everything that was out of reach in time for the crescendo, and he had about 111 pieces working on the Confederate infantry, and that's what decimated him. So Hunt was A+ #1 in his job as artillery coordinator at Gettysburg.
All right, well, thank you for that. And Fernando wants to know, what do you think of Longstreet's participation in the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg? Do you think it helped in that process of healing the nation's wounds from the Civil War?
Oh, yes. General Longstreet was very active after the war with this idea of trying to bind up the nation's wounds. And so he went to an awful lot of reunions and gatherings to do this. There's a really good picture of him with mostly Union generals at Chancellorsville, and General Longstreet did not fight at the Battle of Chancellorsville, but that's an example of why he wanted to be part of these gatherings of both sides to foster those feelings of reunification and brotherhood amongst the veterans. And he did the same, at Gettysburg. He was one of the speakers there at that particular reunion. So that was one of his the main drive, I think, for him to do that, to do those events. Kelly, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, and Claude chimed in on that and said Longstreet was banned from many Confederate veterans groups. David asked, do you support Upton's type of attack?
Oh, Emory Upton, Union Colonel Emory Upton. Yeah, well, I kind of wonder if Colonel Emory Upton, when he does his attack on the mule shoe, that position, the Confederate mule shoe position, that's in 1864, he uses an attack column like Longstreet used at Chickamauga. Now, Longstreet using brigades. Emory Upton used 12 regiments, so it was smaller, and it was successful. He punched through, but he just wasn't supported by the higher up the Union authority, the Union chain of command, and he was pushed out again. But I kind of wonder, was Emory Upton, did he pay attention to what Longstreet had done at Chickamauga? I don't know the answer to that, but it's an observation I've had and a question. But Emory Upton's attack at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania was one of these Schwerpunkt operations for sure.
Very interesting. And one left, even though I'm not quite sure, Tess Evans says, do you know if that written order is housed in the archives? And I'm not quite sure what that is in reference to. It came toward the end of your talk.
Oh, is that you mean that thing I showed up, the one that was that draft letter by Eisenhower? Is he talking about that?
Maybe, yeah. That might be exactly what that's.
I don't know exactly where that draft is. It might be there in Gettysburg at the Eisenhower. There's a Eisenhower museum there. It could be there. I've wanted to find that out, but every now and then, every June, that thing shows up on the internet, and some small article is written about it, and it says all kinds of things that just examining it, I know are not true. Like it was folded up and has creases in it. You put it in his wallet and stuff, and I've looked at the pictures of it, and I don't see any creases and folds in it. Those kinds of things. So if he's talking about that Eisenhower letter that pertains to D-Day, I can only say I think it's in Gettysburg, the Eisenhower Museum at Gettysburg, but I don't know for sure if that's what he means.
And I think it actually, the person clarified and said it was in reference to something someone else had said. So sorry about that sidetrack there on that kind of last question. I will end with just one for you. So what initially got you interested in Longstreet?
That happened when I was a kid. My family came out to Virginia. I'm originally from Chicago, and we came out here to visit the battlefields, to see Civil War battlefields, to see Revolutionary War battlefields, and Mount Vernon and Monticello and all of those kinds of things, to make it a history learning vacation. And when we were at Fredericksburg, the tour guide, the Park Service guy was telling, this is like 1976, I think, it was a bicentennial, and the tour guide was telling everybody how Jackson, was going into great detail about Jackson's defense on the Confederate right, and made it sound like Jackson had won the battle. And then my father, who had also been in the Army in Denmark after World War II, he came over to the United States afterward in the 1950s. He made the comment to the man, he said, well, I appreciate what General Stonewall Jackson did here, but the guy who won the battle here is that Longstreet fellow over here using Murray's Heights. I don't understand why you're not focused on him. And the guy didn't really know what to say. I guess he had memorized the script and didn't really have a lot of knowledge about military things and whatnot. So, my father's comment really stuck with me, and the name Longstreet stuck in my head because of that putting the guy on the spot that he did. And so I got interested in him in that way. But I'd read about him in my childhood and my teenage years, and everything was negative about him. So I wasn't sure what to think. And that's why I said in the beginning, when I got into the Army as an adult and started learning my profession, then I realized all that stuff is propaganda, and a lot of the things that he did were quite good. But to answer your question, I got interested in him because of something my dad said when I was 10 years old.
That's a great story. I love that. And on that note, I will say thank you so much for being here virtually tonight and sharing about your book, General Longstreet, the Confederacy's Most Modern General, which is available through Savas Beatty, and also I am correct, right? Savas Beatty?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
okay, that's what I was saying. It through Savas Beatty, and we also have it in our shop at the American Civil War Museum. So if you're interested in
let me say one thing about Savas Beatty. They asked me to expand it, and it is going to be it's going to be republished. I think the date that they have right now is 1 October, I believe. So the next one that comes out may be somewhat different from this one. I mean, I touched on some of what is on this one, and the new one is going to have even more than that. And whether it has exactly the same title, that's going to be up to the publisher. But if not, it'll at least have this picture of General Longstreet that I've come to like as an interesting piece of art. so that's the future of my book here on him.
Oh, that's great. That's great to know. So. Well, thank you again so much. And I'll say good night to everyone. Everyone have a good rest of your evening and a great weekend. And hope we'll see you on August 25th for our next book talk. So good night, everyone. And thank you.